Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting the U.S. to Canada may be delayed again. This time it has nothing to do with construction delays, inclement weather, or supply shortages.
A social post around 6 p.m. this evening by President Trump threatening to block the opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge.
This project delayed many times because we did a public-private partnership. So because we didn't do a design build, it's been delayed from the 2018.
We discussed the bridge. I explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction of the bridge, over $4 billion, that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada.
Something rare just happened along the U.S.-Canada border, and it caught Washington off guard. A project that was supposed to tighten North American trade links has instead exposed how fragile that relationship has become. When Donald Trump moved to block approval of a new cross-border bridge, the expectation inside his administration was simple: delay Canada, apply pressure, and force concessions. Instead, Canada didn't slow down. It rerouted, redesigned, and quietly advanced without the United States. What was meant to be leverage turned into a loss of control. For decades, border infrastructure between the United States and Canada followed a predictable pattern. Major crossings required federal approval on both sides. Environmental reviews moved slowly. Political negotiations dragged on. Washington always assumed it held veto power simply by being the larger economy. This time, that assumption failed. The bridge in question was designed to relieve congestion on one of the busiest trade corridors in North America. Billions of dollars in goods crossed the border daily, feeding auto plants, energy supply chains, agriculture exports, and manufacturing hubs on both sides. Canadian planners argued the new bridge was essential for long-term growth, supply chain resilience, and reduced dependence on aging infrastructure. For years, planning moved forward quietly with engineers, provincial authorities, and private investors aligned.
Constructed under a public-private partnership-style contract.
Then the politics changed. When Trump returned to aggressive trade tactics, infrastructure became a pressure point. According to officials familiar with the discussions, the White House delayed federal permits tied to the bridge, citing national security reviews, environmental concerns, and strategic alignment. Publicly, the language sounded procedural. Privately, the message was unmistakable. Canada would not get new access without cooperation on broader trade disputes. The move surprised Canadian officials, but it didn't paralyze them. Instead of waiting, Ottawa made a decision that stunned Washington. Canada announced it would proceed with its portion of the project independently, funding and constructing domestic connections, ports, and logistics hubs that no longer depended on immediate U.S. approval.
We discussed the bridge. I explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction of the bridge, over $4 billion, that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada.
Rail expansions were accelerated. Highway interchanges were redesigned. Alternative crossings were upgraded. The bridge itself became only one piece of a larger plan. In other words, Canada stopped asking. This is where the backfire began. By blocking the bridge, Trump expected to control the flow of trade. What actually happened was a redirection of investment. Canadian exporters began routing goods through upgraded ports, alternative crossings, and rail corridors that bypassed U.S. bottlenecks entirely. American logistics firms started losing contracts. Warehousing and customs operations shifted north. Jobs that once depended on cross-border choke points quietly migrated. The irony was hard to miss. The policy meant to protect U.S. leverage weakened it. Trade experts note that modern supply chains are not loyal. They follow speed, predictability, and cost. Once companies invest in new routes, they rarely return to old ones. Canada's push to modernize its side of the border created exactly that kind of lock-in. Even if Washington reverses course later, the traffic patterns may already be set. Politically, the optics were just as damaging. Trump framed the delay as America asserting control over its borders. Canadian leaders framed their response as sovereignty in action. Instead of appearing dependent, Canada projected independence. Provincial premiers lined up behind the strategy, arguing that infrastructure decisions should not be held hostage to foreign politics. Business groups applauded the move, calling it overdue diversification. Behind the scenes, U.S. state officials were furious. Governors and mayors in border states rely heavily on Canadian trade. Manufacturing towns depend on daily truck flows. Auto plants operate on just-in-time delivery. Blocking the bridge threatened local economies far more than Ottawa. Several state leaders quietly urged Washington to reconsider, warning that the delay was costing jobs and investment. But by then, momentum had shifted. Canada's federal government fast-tracked funding approvals, invoking national interest provisions. Construction firms broke ground on connecting infrastructure. Customs modernization projects moved forward. Digital trade processing systems were rolled out to reduce friction at existing crossings. Each step reduced Canada's reliance on a single piece of U.S.-controlled infrastructure. The broader message was unmistakable. If access is uncertain, build alternatives. This episode fits a larger pattern emerging in North American politics. Trump's strategy relies on using market access as leverage. Tariffs, delays, threats, and public pressure are meant to force alignment. That approach works only when the other side lacks options. Canada increasingly does not. Energy exports have diversified. Agricultural shipments now move through multiple global routes. Manufacturing supply chains are being redesigned to reduce exposure. The blocked bridge became a symbol, not of Canadian weakness, but of American overreach. Economists warn that infrastructure weaponization carries long-term risks. When trust erodes, partners invest elsewhere. Control over choke points invites bypasses. What looks like strength in the short term often produces irrelevance in the long run. For Trump, the political calculation may still make sense domestically. Blocking a bridge plays well to a base that equates toughness with restriction. But the economic consequences unfold quietly. Outside campaign speeches and press conferences, lost contracts don't trend on social media. Rerouted trade doesn't make headlines until it's too late. Canada's response also resonated internationally. Other U.S. partners watched closely. The lesson was clear. Dependence on American approvals carries political risk. Countries began reassessing infrastructure, trade routes, and logistic strategies with that reality in mind. Canada's willingness to move ahead signaled that alternatives are possible, even for close allies. In Washington, officials now face an uncomfortable choice: maintain the bloc and accept the erosion of influence, or reverse course and admit the strategy failed. Neither option fits neatly into Trump's narrative. Quiet delays continue, but so does Canadian construction. The bridge may still be built someday, or it may become irrelevant before the first span is finished. Either way, the outcome is already clear. What was meant to slow Canada accelerated its independence. What was meant to assert control exposed its limits. And what was framed as America First ended up pushing trade, investment, and influence north of the border. This was never just about concrete and steel. It was about power, leverage, and the assumption that Canada would wait. It didn't. So now the question is bigger than a bridge. If Canada can push ahead here, where else will it stop asking permission? And how many times can Washington pull the brake before it realizes the traffic has already found another road? If you want more deep dives like this, where politics, economics, and power quietly collide, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and turn on notifications. These shifts don't always happen loudly, but they reshape the future all the same.